You know what happened last Tuesday that made millions of people around the world break down and cry? Pope Leo XIV walked into a room that hadn't been opened in 62 years, and what he found there shook him so hard that his hands wouldn't stop, trembling for 3 days straight. I'm talking about the Vatican Secret Archives Level 7, the place where they keep the stuff that's so sensitive even cardinals don't get to see it. But here's the thing, Pope Leo XIV didn't care about protocol anymore. He'd been losing sleep for months, and it all started with a single letter that arrived at his desk on a rainy Monday morning. The letter was from Sarah Martinez, a grandmother from Phoenix, Arizona. Her handwriting was shaky, like she'd been crying while she wrote it. "Your Holiness," it began. "My grandson Tommy has been asking me the same question for 3 years, and I don't know how to answer him anymore. He says, 'Grandma, if God loves us so much, why doesn't he do miracles like he used to? What am I supposed to tell him?'" That letter hit Pope Leo XIV like a punch to the gut, because deep down he knew the answer, and it was killing him inside. See, Sarah's letter wasn't the only one. Every single day, hundreds of similar letters poured into the Vatican. Parents asking why their prayers felt empty. Kids wondering if God had forgotten about them. People begging to know if miracles were real or just fairy tales from Bible times. Pope Leo XIV would read these letters late at night in his private study, and each one felt like a knife twisting in his heart, because he knew something these people didn't, something that had been locked away since 1962. Something so powerful that 3 different popes before him had sworn to take it to their graves. But this pope was different. Leo XIV had grown up in the streets of Brooklyn before joining the priesthood. He remembered what it felt like to wonder if God actually cared about regular people like him. He remembered praying desperately for his sick mother and feeling like his words just bounced off the ceiling. That quote, "SY," on that Tuesday morning, he made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to level 7, he announced to Cardinal Francesco, his closest advisor. Cardinal Francesco's face went white. "Your Holiness, you can't be serious. The files down there, they're classified for a reason." "What reason?" Pope Leo XIV shot back, his voice rising. "What possible reason could justify keeping God's work hidden from his people?" The cardinal's hands were shaking now too. Because it would change everything. The way people see the church, the way they see themselves, the way they see God. Pope Leo XIV finished. Maybe it's time for that change. The walk down to level 7 felt like it took forever. Each step echoed through the narrow stone corridors, and Pope Leo XIV's heart pounded so loud he was sure Cardinal Francesco could hear it. They passed door after door, each one marked with dates and cryptic labels, until they reached the very last one. The label read, "Operation Sacred Heart, 1962, 1963. Cardinal authorization required." Pope Leo XIV's hands trembled as he inserted the master key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through his very soul. Inside the room, filing cabinets lined every wall, stretching from floor to ceiling. Dust particles danced in the dim light, and the air smelled like old paper and forgotten secrets. But it was the first file that caught his attention. It was thick, bulging with documents, and written on the cover in faded red ink were the words, "Testimonies of confirmed miracles, civilian population, confidential." Pope Leo XIV's breath caught in his throat. Civilian population. That meant regular people, not priests or nuns or church officials, just ordinary folks. With shaking hands, he opened the file. The first document was a typed report dated March 15, 1962. It began. "Father Miguel Rodriguez reports from San Pedro Village, Guatemala, yesterday witnessed unprecedented event. Local woman Maria Santos, age 23, mother of 4, approached. Dying child not her own, suffering from advanced tuberculosis. Child given last rites previous day. Woman knelt, prayed aloud for 10 minutes. Child's breathing normalized within minutes. Full recovery confirmed by Dr. Robert Chen, Methodist Medical Mission. No medical explanation." Pope Leo XIV's legs went weak. He grabbed the edge of the filing cabinet to steady himself. "Cardinal Francesco," he whispered. "How many files are there?" The cardinal's voice was barely audible. "Thousands, Your Holiness. From every continent. Documented, verified, authenticated. And we've kept them secret for 60 years. The decision was made to protect the Church's authority. If people knew that God worked just as powerfully through a peasant woman in Guatemala as through us." Pope Leo XIV felt something break inside his chest. All those letters. All those people wondering if God cared about them. All those children asking their grandparents why miracles didn't happen anymore. They did happen. They never stopped happening. The Church just decided to hide them. He pulled out file after file, document after document. A factory worker in Detroit, whose prayers stopped a massive explosion, saving hundreds of lives. A teenage girl in Mumbai, whose touch healed her neighbor's blindness. A truck driver in rural Texas who prayed over a car accident scene and watched paralyzed victims walk away. Each testimony was signed, dated, verified by multiple witnesses, often including doctors and government officials. These weren't rumors or folklore. These were documented miracles performed by everyday people whose only qualification was faith. Pope Leo XIV sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For 60 years, the Church had let people believe they weren't good enough, holy enough, or special enough for God to work through them. They'd hidden the truth that would have given millions of people hope, purpose, and unshakable faith in God's love. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Francesco said quietly, "what are you going to do?" Pope Leo XIV looked up, and for the first time in months, his eyes blazed with absolute certainty. "I'm going to tell them the truth." And the next 3 days felt like the longest of Pope Leo XIV's life. He barely slept, barely ate, and spent every waking moment reading through file after file of hidden miracles. Each testimony felt like a small earthquake in his heart, shaking everything he thought he knew about faith, about the Church, about God's relationship with ordinary people. Cardinal Francesco tried everything to talk him out of it. "Your Holiness, please think about what this will do to the Church's credibility. People will ask why we kept this secret for so long." "They should ask that question," Pope Leo XIV replied, not looking up from a report about a janitor in Chicago whose prayers had stopped a school shooting. "I'm asking it too." But it wasn't just Cardinal Francesco who was worried. Word had somehow gotten out among the Vatican's inner circle, and by Thursday morning, Pope Leo XIV found himself facing a room full of cardinals, bishops, and church officials, all of them looking like they'd seen a ghost. Cardinal Martinez, from Spain, spoke first. "Your Holiness, we've served the Church faithfully for decades. We've protected its traditions, its authority, its sacred role in the world. What you're proposing, it could destroy everything we've built." Pope Leo XIV stood up slowly. In his hands, he held a photograph from 1963, a black and white image of Maria Santos, the young mother from Guatemala, kneeling beside a child who should have been dead. The child was sitting up, laughing, completely healthy. "Tell me something," the Pope said, his voice calm but still hard. "When this woman saved this child's life through prayer, was that God's work or not?" "Of course it was God's work. And when we decided to hide it, to act like it never happened, to let Maria Santos think she was crazy or making it up, was that God's work too?" The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Pope Leo XIV walked to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. Even now, in the middle of a weekday, hundreds of people were gathered there. Tourists, pilgrims, locals, all of them looking up at these windows, hoping for a glimpse of something holy, something that would remind them that God was real. "Gifo, know what breaks my heart?" he said, still looking out the window. "Those people down there. They think God stopped doing miracles. They think the age of divine intervention ended with the apostles. They pray, and when nothing obvious happens, they wonder if God even hears them." He turned back to face the room. But God never stopped. People like Maria Santos, like factory worker James Mitchell in Detroit, like teenager Priya Sharma in Mumbai, They've been God's hands and feet and voice this entire time, and we've been telling the world that only we can access the divine. Cardinal Francesco tried one more time. But Your Holiness, what about church doctrine? What about the role of ordained clergy? What about the woman who touched Jesus' cloak and was healed? Pope Leo XIV interrupted. Was she ordained? What about the centurion whose servant Jesus healed from a distance? What about the Samaritan woman at the well? Jesus didn't check their credentials before he worked through them. He picked up another file. This one from Brazil, 1967. Listen to this. Father Antonio writes, I was prepared to perform last rites for 17 people in our village who contracted a mysterious fever. Local woman Isabella Cruz asked if she could pray with them first. I almost said no. What could she do that I hadn't already tried? But something in her eyes made me step back. She knelt with each person one by one and prayed in a way I'd never heard before, not reciting liturgy or formal prayers, but talking to God like he was, right there in the room with her. By morning, all 17 were completely healed. I tested their blood myself. The fever was gone. Not just the symptoms, but every trace of the illness. The local doctor called it impossible. I called it God. Pope Leo XIV set the file down gently. Father Antonio writes that Isabella never asked for credit, never told anyone outside the village, never even mentioned it again. She just went back to her life, taking care of her family, trusting that God would work through whoever he chose, whenever he chose. The room was still silent. But something had shifted. Pope Leo XIV could see it in their faces. The dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd been looking at this all wrong. I've been reading these files for 3 days, he continued. 3 days of documented miracles performed by housekeepers and teachers and farmers and mechanics, people who never went to seminary, who don't know Latin, who would probably be nervous just shaking hands with a bishop. And you know what they all have in common? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Faith. Pure, simple, childlike faith in a God who loves them so much that he trusts them with his power. Not because they earned it, not because they're perfect, but because they believe. Cardinal Martinez cleared his throat. And what about the people who pray and don't see miracles? What do we tell them? Pope Leo XIV smiled for the first time in days. We tell them the truth, that God hears every prayer, answers every prayer, but not always in ways we expect or understand. We tell them that sometimes the miracle isn't physical healing. Sometimes it's strength to endure, or peace in the storm, or the right words at the right moment, or simply the assurance that they're loved beyond measure. He looked around the room one more time. Brothers, we have a choice. We can keep protecting our secrets and our authority, or we can trust God's people with the truth about how much he loves them and trusts them. We can keep pretending that God needs our permission to work through his children, or we can celebrate the fact that he's been working through them all along. The silence stretched on, but Pope Leo XIV knew his decision was made. I'm calling a press conference for Sunday morning, right here in St. Peter's Square. It's time the world knew what God has really been up to. By Saturday night, word had leaked. Somehow reporters had gotten wind that something big was coming, and St. Peter's Square was buzzing with activity. News vans lined the streets, camera, crew set up equipment, and journalists from every major network in the world waited. Barely contained excitement. But inside the Vatican, it felt like a war zone. Pope Leo XV sat in his private study, surrounded by stacks of the files he'd spent the week reading. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Cardinals from around the world were calling, some begging him to reconsider, others demanding to know what he planned to say. The most painful call came from Cardinal Thompson in New York. Leo, he said, using the Pope's first name like they were still young priests together. I've known you for 30 years. You're not a reckless man, but this feels reckless. What if people lose faith in the church? What if they stop coming to Mass? Stop following church teachings? What if we lose our ability to guide them? Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes. Cardinal Thompson was a good man, a friend, someone whose opinion mattered. Michael, he said softly, what if they've already lost faith? What if they've stopped coming because they feel like God is distant, unreachable, only available through official channels? What if our authority has become a wall between people and their Creator? There was a long pause. You really think this is what God wants? I think God wants His children to know how much He loves them. I think He wants them to stop feeling like second-class citizens in their own faith. Pope Leo XIV's voice caught. I think He wants them to stop writing letters asking if He's forgotten about them. After hanging up, Pope Leo XIV walked to his window. The square below was filling up even though it was past midnight. People were camping out, sleeping and sleeping. Bags and makeshift shelters, all waiting for whatever announcement was coming. That quote S when he saw her. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, sitting alone on a small folding chair near the fountain. She had gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and wore a faded blue coat. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her lips were moving silently. She was praying. Something about her reminded him of Sarah Martinez, the grandmother from Phoenix who'd written that first letter about her grandson Tommy. Maybe it was the way she sat, so patient, so hopeful, like she'd been waiting her whole life for something. Pope Leo XIV made a decision that would have horrified his security team. He put on a simple black jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out through a side entrance he'd used as a young priest when he needed to clear his head. The woman looked up as he approached, and her eyes widened in recognition. But she didn't make a scene, didn't call out or draw attention. She just smiled, a smile so warm and full of faith that it nearly broke his heart. Your Holiness, she whispered. I'm Rosa Santos. Pope Leo XIV's breath caught. Santos? Are you related to Maria Santos from Guatemala? The woman's smile grew brighter. She was my daughter. She passed away 10 years ago, but before she died, she told me something. She said that someday the Church would tell people the truth about what God can do through anyone who believes. Pope Leo XIV felt his knees go weak. He sat down on the edge of the fountain, not caring about protocol or dignity. Your daughter, the little boy she healed. Miguel, he grew up to become a doctor. He saved thousands of lives, all because my Maria listened when God whispered to her heart that day. Rosa reached into her purse and pulled out a faded photograph. This is them, the day after the healing. Look at Miguel's face. You can see the life that came back into his eyes. Pope Leo XIV stared at the photograph with trembling hands. The little boy was indeed glowing with health and happiness, and Maria Santos looked exactly like her daughter, humble, gentle, but with eyes that held unshakable faith. Mrs. Santos, he said quietly, tomorrow morning I'm going to tell the world about your daughter's miracle, about thousands of miracles performed by people just like her. But I need you to know, there are people who think I'm making a terrible mistake. Rosa Santos reached over and patted his hand like he was one of her grandchildren. Your Holiness, can I tell you something my Maria said to me the night before she died? He nodded, not trusting his voice. She said, Mama, God doesn't need the Church's permission to love His people. But maybe someday the Church will realize that it doesn't need to hoard God's love to be important. Maybe someday they'll understand that their job isn't to control God's power, but to help people recognize it when they see it. Pope Leo XIV felt tears running down his cheeks. She said that? She did. And then she said, when that day comes, Mama, miracles won't be the exception anymore. They'll be as natural as breathing, because people will finally understand that God trusts them with His love. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the early morning crowds begin to gather. Finally, Rosa Santos stood up and folded her chair. I'll be in the front row tomorrow, Your Holiness, and I'll be praying for you. She paused. Not for your success, but for your peace, because I think you already know you're doing the right thing. As she walked away, Pope Leo XIV felt something settle in his chest. The doubt, the fear, the weight of opposition, it was still there, but it no longer felt crushing. Rosa Santos was right. Deep in his heart, in that place where God's voice was clearest, he knew this was right. He stood up and looked out over the square, now filled with thousands of people from all over the world. Tomorrow their lives would change. Tomorrow they would learn that God had never stopped believing in them. Tomorrow the secret would finally be free. But tonight, for just a few more hours, Pope Leo XIV carried the weight of truth alone. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, and by 9 a.m. St. Peter's Square was packed with over 200,000 people. It was the largest spontaneous gathering in Vatican history, and the energy in the air was electric. People had traveled from every corner of the earth. Some had driven all night. Others had flown halfway around the world, all drawn by the rumor that something unprecedented was about to happen. Pope Leo XIV stood at his window, watching the sea of faces below. In the front rows, he could see Rosa Santos, exactly where she'd promised to be. Near her sat a young man who looked remarkably like the boy in the photograph, Dr. Miguel, all grown up, probably in his 60s now. Cardinal Francesco appeared at his elbow, making one final plea. "Your Holiness, it's not too late. We could announce something else. A new charitable initiative, a call for peace. Anything but—" "Francesco," Pope Leo XIV said gently, "look at their faces. Really look at them." The cardinal peered out the window. Below, families sat together on blankets. Children played between the rows. Elderly people leaned on walking sticks with expressions of hope they probably hadn't felt in years. There were people in wheelchairs, people holding photographs of lost loved ones, people with tears already streaming down their faces, even though nothing had happened yet. "They're not here for ceremony," Pope Leo XIV continued. "They're here because something in their hearts told them that today, something real was going to happen. Today they might finally hear that God sees them, knows them, loves them exactly as they are." At exactly 10 a.m., Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. The crowd erupted in cheers, but he raised his hand for silence. When the square finally quieted, you could hear birds singing in the distance. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a young mother named Maria Santos, who lived in a small village in Guatemala 62 years ago." He paused, his eyes finding Rosa Santos in the crowd. She was smiling through her tears, nodding encouragement. Maria was not a nun. She was not a priest. She had never studied theology or performed official church duties. She was simply a mother who loved her children, helped her neighbors, and talked to God like he was her closest friend. And one day, when a little boy was dying and everyone had given up hope, Maria knelt beside his bed and prayed with such faith, such trust, such love, that God healed him completely. The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. This miracle was documented. It was verified by doctors, witnessed by dozens of people, and reported to the Vatican. And do you know what we did with this beautiful testimony of God's love working through an ordinary person? Pope Leo XIV's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "We hid it. We buried it in our archives and classified it as confidential. We decided that the world wasn't ready to know that God works just as powerfully through a peasant woman in Guatemala as through anyone in these halls." Gasps rippled through the crowd. In the VIP section, cardinals shifted uncomfortably, but Pope Leo XIV pressed on. "For 62 years we have kept secret thousands of documented miracles performed by people just like you. Grandmothers and mechanics, teachers and farmers, teenagers and truck drivers. Ordinary people who had extraordinary faith and whom God trusted with his power." He held up a thick file folder. "This contains testimonies from every continent on Earth. A factory worker in Detroit whose prayers prevented a massive explosion. A teenage girl in Mumbai whose touch restored her neighbor's sight. A janitor in Chicago whose faith stopped violence before it could start. Documented miracles. All of them. Hidden miracles. Forgotten miracles." The crowd was starting to murmur now, a low rumble of shock, confusion, and growing excitement. We told ourselves we were protecting the Church's authority, Pope Leo XIV continued, his voice rising. But the truth is we were afraid that if people knew how much God trusted them, they might not need us anymore. We forgot that our job isn't to control God's power. Our job is to help you recognize it when it appears in your lives. And that's when something incredible happened. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman stood up. She was probably in her 50s, wearing a simple yellow dress, and she was crying as she spoke. "Holy Father," she called out, her voice somehow carrying across the vast square. "My name is Jennifer Walsh from Boston, Massachusetts. Last year my daughter was in a car accident. The doctors said she'd never walk again. But I prayed over her every single day, and I sang to her, and I told God that I trusted Him no matter what. And 3 months later, she took her first steps." The crowd gasped. Then another person stood up, an elderly man near the back. "I'm Robert Chen from San Francisco. I'm a doctor, and I don't understand what I saw. But when my patient Maria Elena was dying of cancer, her grandmother came in and prayed in Spanish for 6 hours straight. The next morning, every scan came back clean. I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of medicine." Now people were standing up all over the square, sharing their stories, their testimonies, their experiences of God working through ordinary faith in extraordinary ways. Pope Leo XIV felt his heart soaring. This was it. This was what he'd hoped for. What Rosa Santos and her daughter Maria had envisioned. People realizing that they weren't second-class citizens in God's kingdom. They were His beloved children, trusted with His power, called to be His hands and feet in the world. "My dear friends," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "God has never stopped performing miracles. He has never stopped loving you. He has never stopped trusting you with His power. We just stopped telling you about it." He raised the file folder high above his head. "Today that ends. Today we begin the People's Miracle Archive, where anyone, regardless of education, position, or credentials, can share their testimony of God's work in their lives." The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of St. Peter's. But Pope Leo XIV wasn't finished, and I want to say something to every person who has ever wondered if their prayers matter, if God hears them, if they're good enough for divine intervention. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. "You are enough. Your faith is enough. God's love for you is more than enough." The crying started then, not just from a few people, but from thousands upon thousands of voices. A wave of emotion that swept across the square like a cleansing rain. In the weeks that followed what the media dubbed Miracle Sunday, something extraordinary happened to the Catholic Church, something none of the worried cardinals had expected. Instead of people leaving the church, they came flooding back. Churches around the world reported attendance increases of 300%, 400%, even 500%. But these weren't people coming to sit passively in pews. These were people coming to share their stories, to pray for each other, to discover what God might want to do through them. Pope Leo XIV received over 1 million letters in the first month alone. But these letters were different from the ones that had started his journey. Instead of desperation and doubt, they overflowed with hope, gratitude, and testimonies of newfound faith. "Your Holiness," wrote David Martinez from Denver, "I haven't been to Mass in 15 years. Ever since my wife died, I decided God had forgotten about people like me. But after watching your speech, I remembered something. The night before my wife passed, she squeezed my hand and told me she could see angels in the room. I thought it was the medication talking. Now I realize it was God, letting us know that death wasn't the end. I'm back, Holy Father, and I'm bringing my grandchildren with me." The Vatican's new People's Miracle Archive crashed within hours of going live. Not from technical problems, but from the sheer volume of people wanting to share their experiences. Stories poured in from every corner of the globe, in dozens of languages, from people who had been carrying these miraculous moments in their hearts for years, decades, sometimes their entire lives. Sarah Martinez, the grandmother from Phoenix whose letter had started it all, flew to Rome with her grandson Tommy. When they met Pope Leo XIV in person, Tommy asked the question that had been burning in his 8-year-old heart. Papa Leo, does God really do miracles through kids too? Pope Leo XIV knelt down to Tommy's eye level. Let me tell you about a little girl named Lucia from Portugal who saw visions of Mary when she was just your age. Let me tell you about Samuel in the Bible, who heard God's voice when he was even younger than you. And let me tell you something very important, Tommy. He smiled. God doesn't look at how old you are or how tall you are or how much you know. He looks at your heart. Tommy's eyes went wide. So if I pray for my friend Jake who has autism, God might really help him? God is already helping him, Tommy. Sometimes through doctors, sometimes through teachers, sometimes through good friends who care enough to pray. The question isn't whether God will help. The question is whether you're ready to be part of how he helps. 3 months later, Pope Leo XIV received a video from Tommy's school. It showed Tommy and Jake playing together at recess. Tommy patiently helping Jake join the games and making sure no one teased him. At the end of the video, Jake looked into the camera and said, "Tommy is my best friend. He prays for me every day, and it works because I'm not scared at school anymore." But perhaps the most powerful moment came 6 months after Miracle Sunday, when Dr. Miguel, the little boy Maria Santos had healed all those years ago, returned to his village in Guatemala to establish a free medical clinic. The funding came from donations inspired by his story. The staff included both medical professionals and local people who had witnessed miracles in their own lives. Pope Leo XIV traveled to Guatemala to bless the clinic's opening. As he stood in the same village where Maria Santos had knelt beside a dying child 62 years earlier, he was surrounded by 3 generations of the Santos family. Rosa was there, now in her 90s, still sharp as a tack. Miguel was there with his own children and grandchildren, and scattered throughout the crowd were dozens of people who had been touched, directly or indirectly, by Maria's simple act of faith. "Your Holiness," Miguel said during the ceremony, "my mother Maria never knew that her prayer that day would be hidden away in Vatican files. She never knew it would take 6 decades for the world to hear about it, but I think she would say the same thing today that she said to me when I was a boy. Mijo, God's timing is perfect, even when we don't understand it." He paused, his voice steady. Maybe the world needed to be ready to hear that. Miracles aren't about being special. They're about being willing. That night, as Pope Leo XIV walked through the village, he stopped at a small shrine that had been built where Maria Santos's house once stood. Someone had carved her words into a stone marker. God doesn't need perfect people, he just needs willing hearts. As he knelt there in prayer, Pope Leo XIV thought about all the lives that had changed since that Tuesday morning when he'd first opened those classified files. He thought about children like Tommy, who now knew their prayers mattered. He thought about people like Jennifer Walsh, who had discovered that their faith was powerful enough to move mountains. He thought about the thousands of testimonies still pouring into the Vatican every day. But most of all, he thought about Sarah Martinez's original letter. The one that had started it all. Her grandson Tommy had asked why God didn't do miracles anymore, and she hadn't known what to tell him. Now she did. Now they all did. God had never stopped doing miracles. He had never stopped loving his children. He had never stopped trusting ordinary people with extraordinary power. The church had just forgotten how to tell them about it. As Pope Leo XIV walked back toward his simple lodging for the night, he could hear the sounds of celebration continuing in the village square. People sharing stories, praying together, laughing with the joy that comes from knowing you are seen, known, and deeply loved by the Creator of the universe. And somewhere in heaven, he imagined Maria Santos smiling, knowing that her simple prayer, beside a dying child, had finally become what it was always meant to be. Not a secret to be hidden, but a light to guide others home to faith. The secret was out. The truth was free, and millions of people around the world were discovering. They had never been forgotten. They had only forgotten to remember how deeply they were loved.